Hi, I'm Ryan Chamberlain, your host of Ripples from the Land, a podcast where my co-host John Grabowski and I explore how regional stories that start in the Cleveland area can sometimes ripple out across the globe in unlikely and unusual ways. Today's episode is called Cleveland and the Civil War, which was recorded live at the Music Box Supper Club and emceed by Mike Miller. Joining us on stage this episode was Meghan Schill, an associate editor for the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, and a doctoral candidate in the history department at Case Western Reserve University. In addition, she's also a national park ranger and Civil War interpreter. Yeah, she knows her stuff. Hope you enjoy. Please like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Also, a shout out to Dante LaFloria for producing this episode.
All right, so remind everyone, actually, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I'll say it. You guys said, okay, let's do one on the Civil War. And I said, okay, cool. And then this past week when I'm preparing, I was like, okay, when did that happen? So remind people. I mean, just the basic.
Yeah, absolutely. Always good. Like I said, I've worked at battlefields. It's good to assume that people don't know anything about the war. It's always better to, give a nice baseline. So Civil War starts in 1861, April of 1861. Argue that it starts a little earlier with the election of Abraham Lincoln. Then in the December of 1860 is when the first state secedes, and then more will go from there. Eventually, a total of 11 southern states will secede from the Union,
They're disagreeing with you. But
yes. So they secede from the Union, arguing that they should be able to make their own decisions, specifically really about the issue of slavery, especially. There's, multiple Confederate generals. The vice president of the Confederacy gives a speech known as the Cornerstone Speech right at the beginning of the war, in which he says he's defining what this new Confederate nation will be. And the cornerstone of that nation, the most important part of that foundation, is slavery. It's in there in his inaugural address. So that really is the largest cause of the war. Now, I won't say that that's the only reason people fight, because people fight for all kinds of different reasons. There are absolutely soldiers who fight in the war on both sides over the issues of slavery, but there's some guys who think that this is going to be a great adventure. They think it's going to be fun. All of their buddies are signing up. They see soldiers marching in Zouave uniforms that are red with white gaiters and fezzes, and they think those are the coolest guys, and all the girls think they're really cute. So I want one of those. There's soldiers who just want a steady paycheck, and they want to have 3 square meals a day, or really, it's not what they end up getting. But, they're getting fed, they're getting paid. That is why they're fighting personally. So I like to say that you can look at, there's a difference between causes and the reasons why soldiers fight. The war eventually ends in April of 1865 with various surrenders, starting with Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And then partway through April, President Lincoln is assassinated.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, let's get back. Actually, one of the things I read, and I think I might have read this in the encyclopedia, John, is Abraham Lincoln was the first candidate from the Republican Party to ever win the presidency. I mean, I was kind of shocked to see that the Republican Party was not that strong prior to that.
Well, John C. Fremont had run in a previous election, and he lost. And the
So wait a minute, when did the Republican Party start then?
It was 5 years before the war.
Oh, really?
5 years, but I think five years before Lincoln's election.
Yeah, Ripon, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Oh, that's kind of fascinating. So I know we have Ripples from the Land coming up a little bit on the politics of Cleveland and the politics impact across the country. So wanted to mention that.
Yep.
All right, John, what's happening in Cleveland in 1855, 1856? What's happening to Cleveland just prior to the war? What does Cleveland look like?
Well, Cleveland is growing fast, and it's growing for two major reasons: location and technologies that are being created at that point. So the first thing is we go back to the 1830s, completion of the Ohio and Erie Canal, which makes Cleveland a major lake port. And when you talk about the Ohio and Erie Canal, it's not simply the towpath that we bike on today, but you have to look to the east. So if you go from the lakefront in Cleveland, where the canal ends in 1832, you go to Buffalo. You then get on the Erie Canal, and that takes you to Albany. You go down the Hudson River, and you're in New York. In New York, you have access to all the ports in Europe. If you go in the other direction, you're in Portsmouth, Ohio, and the Ohio River. That will take you to the Mississippi River, give you access to St. Louis, down to New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. So suddenly, Cleveland is on the center of a major transportation route. And that helps farmers in the center of Ohio package and move their goods, and also makes Cleveland a major transshipment point. And particularly if we're in the flats right now, there's a little street called Merwin Street. Anybody been there? Yeah, the Merwin Street was basically where the commodities brokers were, where the ships came in with wholesale loads of goods, and they were then parceled out for retail. And we talked about John D. Rockefeller, that's where he got his start. But also in the 1850s, Cleveland gets a railroad system. And by the time of the Civil War, Cleveland is connected to New York, to Chicago, to Pittsburgh, if you want to mention that name, if you're a Browns fan, and to St. Louis. So the railroad system is in the center of everything. And before Chicago begins to grow, Cleveland is one of the spots on the western part of the United States that is really growing. So we're looking at a population that goes from 606 people in 1820 to over 40,000 people by the time of the Civil War. So it is a spectacular growth. It's a mercantile community, and it also has some nascent industries. I love that word, nascent, right? One of them is the Cuyahoga Steam Furnace Company on the west side of the Cuyahoga River, and they produce boilers, and they eventually produced railroad locomotives. So you're beginning to see the Cleveland that many of us remember that existed into the 1960s.
All right. I bet you, though, a lot of people aren't aware that just leading into the Civil War, there was something called the Panic of 1857. Which was essentially one of the first huge depressions of this country.
Yeah, there was a panic in the 1830s as well. And so if you look at the history of depressions, it's just not the one of the 1930s.
Yeah, the economy is just riddled with recessions and depressions throughout the 19th century, just based on the economic systems. It's not as stable as we expect nowadays, and so there were a lot more panics, there were runs on banks, there were all kinds of issues then. But yeah, the ones right before the war are particularly bad.
Yeah, and there's one after the war that's incredible. It's in the 1873. And that is due to a man we'll talk about if we have time. His name is Jay Cook. He's from basically Sandusky, Ohio.
So let's go attack Sandusky. Anyways.
What? Well, we'll talk about Jay Cook later, but right. His banking institution, which was backing bonds for Northern Pacific Railroad, crashes, and that takes everything with it.
All right, so let's go back. Civil War, almost day one. So the South starts seceding. What started happening in Cleveland? How fast did Cleveland start recruiting for regiments and start, you're talking April is the start of the war. When did our first regiments get formed here in Cleveland to go fight the war?
Right away. Cleveland, Ohio especially, but Cleveland is very quick to start getting men recruited and getting them ready to ship out. So there's 3 different Civil War camps around the Cleveland area to handle the large number of soldiers who are volunteering. After Fort Sumter is fired upon, Lincoln puts out a call for 75,000 troops for 3 months. So Clevelanders respond. They send thousands of men out to form regiments serving for just that limited amount of time. That is not going to be how long they actually end up serving, though.
All right, but again, there were immediately camps, training camps is what you're talking about,
yes.
Sprinkled around Cleveland, getting ready to send regiments to war. So again, I know very quickly we had a pretty famous regiment.
Yes.
Let's turn to that.
Yes. So for those of you who are here for the blood and the guts, yes, we'll start out strong with the 23rd Ohio. Some of you may be familiar with this regiment. It's a pretty famous one, probably the most famous regiment from the Cleveland area. The 23rd is important not only for what it does on the battlefield, but for what it does after the war, because these men don't stop helping one another. They don't stop climbing the social ladder after the war is over. Within the 23rd, there are 5 generals. 5 men get promoted to general out of their ranks during the war. two men will become president. Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley. They both serve in the 23rd. There is also a Supreme Court justice.
And this is a Cleveland regiment, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Supreme Court Justice, Senator Robert P. Kennedy, not related to the other Robert Kennedy that you may know from later, separate Kennedy family, but a Senator Robert Kennedy nonetheless coming out of there. And it's important not only in politics, but also in newspapers. The founder of the LA Times newspaper also serves in the 23rd Ohio. And so these newspaper men, there's another one who ends up starting a political newspaper in Columbus, Ohio after the war, and helps get some of these other men elected to political office. Also starts a minor league baseball team.
Cool.
But yes, on the battlefield, the 23rd becomes well known after the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862.
All right, well, come on. Let's go into that battle. What made this 23rd so famous? Because they won a lot of battles in a sense, right?
Yes, so the 23rd distinguishes itself at Antietam. For those of you who are familiar with how armies are set up, they're divided into corps. At the Battle of Antietam, the 23rd Ohio is part of the 9th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, the U.S. Army there, under the command of someone known as Ambrose Burnside, who, if you're familiar with the Civil War at all, that name might ring a bell as to the Fredericksburg. Not the best of showing there. Burnside was probably a much stronger corps commander than he was an overall army commander. But he gets a lot of flack for what happens at Antietam. However, I will say he does get the job done, although it's a lot bloodier than it probably should have been. But that's for armchair historians to decide whether he makes the right call or not. Burnside is told that he has to take a bridge over over Antietam Creek, and he does so with the 23rd. So the 23rd is part of that push to get that bridge. It takes all day, but they do it. And if you ever go to the battlefield at Antietam, it seems, if you're just looking at it on a map, it's not that big of a deal. You cross a bridge and then you
It's
walk
a creek
over.
for crying out loud.
How bad could it be? Yeah. So it's got fairly steep sides. There's a very small bridge to get you over, very narrow, and the ground on the other side of that is a steep hill. So not only do they have to cross the creek, they also have to get up that hill, which is something that often gets overlooked. And so there's actually a monument to the 23rd at right by what's now known as Burnside's Bridge on the at the battlefield.
And
of Antietam.
again, this is almost all Clevelanders, correct?
Yeah, the 23rd. Yep. Yeah,
All
it's
right.
made up almost entirely of those from soldiers from Cuyahoga County.
All right. So, Brian, I'm going to get you involved.
Okay.
Lincoln, new president. During the war, after the war, his presence in Cleveland, how many times did he come through?
Lincoln, he came to Cleveland. He's known for coming to Cleveland twice, once in life and once in death. The first time was in 1861 after his election and his triumphant kind of railroad tour down to D.C. He stopped in Cleveland and he was given a military escort, arrived in Union Station.
Yeah, it would be the Lakefront Depot at that point, West 9th Street, yeah.
And then went along Euclid Avenue, made a turn at 9th, and then went to the Waddell House, which is now known as the Rockefeller Building. He's known for giving a speech off of the balcony. John, when we were talking, you had something to add to that?
Yeah, it's basically when Lincoln was on his way to Washington, the states were already seceding, and he was taking a middle-of-the-road stance. He was trying to keep the Union together. And so some people in Cleveland who were ardent abolitionists were disappointed with what he said, but he was trying to balance something and save the Union at that point. That's the story of his speech, but it's the first time he came to Cleveland. Interestingly, the Historical Society, I have to do a plug for the Historical Society, has a letter from Abraham Lincoln to the mayor of Cleveland accepting his invitation to stop at Cleveland on his way to Washington.
Mm-hmm. And there's a plaque on the building honoring his speech on the Rockefeller Building.
Yeah.
Now.
We also supposedly have a desk that purportedly was in the suite of rooms that he used in the Waddell House.
All right. But to be clear, he wasn't stopping along the way and giving the same speech. This was an important speech, and it was given in Cleveland.
Yeah, it was given in Cleveland, but as he stopped along the way, it was the same conversation he was having because he's desperately trying to save the Union at that point.
Yeah, kind of a stump speech, exactly what you said.
Yeah. All right, so one of the things, again, and this is on this encyclopedia, Confederate General John Mosby once said, I never heard any cause of the war that was not slavery. And so this is a key topic. You know, what are the thoughts? Meghan, let's start with you. What did Clevelanders think about slavery and, abolition that came along?
Yeah, there's a large sentiment in Cleveland for preserving the Union. Above all, there's always support for the war in Cleveland itself. There's also a fairly strong abolitionist movement. We were talking earlier about some underground railroad activity that happened in the area. So the abolitionists have a pretty strong foothold in the Cleveland community. Democrats at the time are largely less interested in ending slavery than they are in preserving the Union when it comes to the war effort. But I know each of my fellows here have things to say about this too, so we can pass it on down.
Yeah, Cleveland, as you probably know, starts from the Connecticut Western Reserve and people from New England who come with that sort of Puritan heritage. Presbyterians or Congregationalists. And they tend to be anti-slavery. There's a division. Anti-slavery is you disagree with slavery, you want to end it sometime, somehow, in a reasonable way. One of the ways of ending it, they proposed, was colonization, send African Americans back to Africa, which was absurd because by that point, African Americans had been in the United States for generations. They had no connection to Africa. Abolitionists said it was morally, religiously wrong, and it needed to be stopped right now. And so you had abolitionists in Cleveland. The Severance family was active. They were African Americans active in the Underground Railroad. John Brown, not the John Brown, but a black barber in Cleveland who worked down in the flats. He was the last connection between coming up from the South and getting on a boat to Canada and freedom. So you have that. One of the most ardent abolitionists in Cleveland. You ready for this? You ready? Jim Tomey. There was a minister who was born as the son of a slaveholder. He's a Congregationalist, came to Cleveland, was at the First Congregational Church of Ohio City, and he became an ardent opponent of slavery. Western Reserve University almost split over the issue of slavery, those people who wanted colonization and those people who wanted absolute abolition. So it is in the genes of Northeastern Ohio, the Connecticut Western Reserve, to be quizzical, opposed to, it's somewhat, are compromising on how to deal with slavery.
Mm-hmm. Good window into Clevelanders' attitudes towards slavery at the time is the Lucy Bagby fugitive slave case, which was one of the last fugitive slave cases before the Civil War. It took place in January 1861, and Lucy Bagby she'd escaped from Wheeling, then Virginia, and had followed the Underground Railroad through Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, and eventually landed in Cleveland. She was a domestic servant for for a local politician and then a jeweler later on. When she was the person who she was enslaved by, the Goshorn family, John Goshorn and William Goshorn, they somehow caught wind that she was in Cleveland, and they came up using the Fugitive Slave Act, which is important to understanding the Civil War and slavery and attitudes towards Civil War. Attitudes towards slavery, claiming rights which is the Fugitive Slave Act, for those who don't know, is the kind of legal underpinning that legally enforced slavery. And so when William Goshorn came up to get Lucy Bagby, it was enforced by U.S. Marshals. There was a public outcry, but there was also, a lot of complicitness in the political establishment because it was, they were facing the threat of disunion. Yeah. So it's kind of, what do you do? But all eyes of the nation were kind of on Cleveland at that moment. And the result was that Lucy Bagby got sent back down to Wheeling. Legally, they had a court case. Goshorn was able to prove she was a slave to Goshorn, so they really had no legal standing under the Fugitive Slave Act, so they let her go. And the result, there is a silver lining. They
let her go.
She
was
Thank you
taken
for correcting
back.
me.
Yeah.
Taken back. I've
she was
been
taken
very
back
careful.
to- yeah.
There is no, yes, she was taken back. Thank you for correcting me. But the silver lining to the whole thing is that Wheeling was one of the first places occupied by the Union troops in the South. Goshorn she was able to be free 6 months later. And also, she made her way back to Cleveland. Footnote to the story, she made her way back to Cleveland via Pittsburgh again, and she gave a talk at the Settlers Association in 1904. There's a record of that where she talked about her experiences. It was Settlers Association at Gray's Armory, and she died 2 years later. She was heralded as a hero, but she was buried in an unmarked grave. And so in 2010, there was a volunteer movement. She was buried in Woodland Cemetery. So there was a movement to get her a grave marker, and so now, as of 2010, she's recognized, and on her, if you see her tombstone in Woodland Cemetery, it reads "Unfettered and Free." So,
And Woodland Cemetery is probably the cemetery that has the most local Civil War history in it. It was the main public cemetery in Cleveland, and that's where there are a lot of monuments for soldiers and people like Lucy Bagby Johnson. There's another case before this. In 1858, a man named John Price, an African-American and former enslaved person, was living freely in Oberlin, and Oberlin was fully abolitionist. And a slave catcher came up and identified him, lured him out of town, captured him, took him to Wellington, Ohio, to put him on a train to get him back to Cincinnati, where he would be tried in sort of a kangaroo court, if you will. And the citizens of Oberlin, both black and white, rose up, went to Wellington, surrounded the hotel, and freed him, got him back to Oberlin, put him on a ship to Canada and to freedom. They had just violated the 1854 Fugitive Slave Act, which could, if you helped a fugitive slave, could cost you $1,000 at that time.
Or jail time.
Or jail time. And so 37 of the rescuers were brought to Cleveland in 1859 to be tried at the courthouse, which was then on Public Square. It was a brand new building. What did Cleveland do? Well, guess what? They were never in a jail cell. They had the run of the courthouse. The women of the town baked food for them, brought in food for them. They published one issue of a newspaper called The Rescuer while they were in the courthouse, and the citizens of Cleveland gathered on Public Square to exhort them. Now, 3 of them eventually went to trial, but nobody was convicted. But this is the change in attitude before secession and after secession.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow, cool stories. All right, so let's go back. We talked about the 23rd.
Yes.
But they weren't the only.
They were not, no. If you look at the census records and everything, there were about 15,000 men eligible for service based on like draft qualifications in Cuyahoga County during the Civil War. 10,000 men served. So,
holy cow.
Yeah.
Now, and didn't Ohio produce one of the first all-black regiments that went to war?
Yes, so the 54th Massachusetts gets a lot of attention as the first black regiment. However, they are not the only ones. So Ohio in general has a number of African-American regiments, and they serve gallantly throughout the Civil War. So those get started after the Emancipation Proclamation takes effect, January 1st, 1863. There are a few all-black regiments that form illegally before that, one of which is the 1st Kansas Colored, which is at a national park site I worked at. So they were the first to see combat, and they were illegally mustered in 1862 before they were legally allowed to.
But again, that all came out of here. Let's talk about the McKinley Monument, and because how did that happen?
Yeah, so I mentioned the 23rd, right? So William McKinley served as a junior officer in the 23rd Ohio. That regiment is interesting for so many reasons. They're also one of the only regiments, one of the very few, to have more soldiers die of battlefield wounds than of disease. And you know you're really fighting hard when that's the case. Most Civil War soldiers died of disease. So for a regiment to have more soldiers die in battle, they're in the thick of it. So William McKinley, he does have a monument there. It wasn't put up right after the war. It's actually put up a year after he was assassinated. So right at the beginning of the 1900s. That's put up, and it's an interesting story on that one. I haven't seen another monument like it because it has a list of all of his accomplishments as a politician, lists all of those, governor of Ohio, served as president for 2 terms, all of that. And then it's for his service of bringing, during the Battle of Antietam, while all of this fighting is going on, the monument says that it is to his bravery, bringing hot coffee and warm food to his fellow soldiers while the fighting is going on.
So I should have a statue at Cleveland Square,
Absolutely, yes.
All right.
Yes.
I do that every night. Hot coffee and warm.
Yes,
Jesus.
so
Okay.
I haven't seen another monument that's dedicated to the good food service, but clearly it was important enough. I mean, it gets made fun of a lot because of that, because, everyone's like, hot coffee, warm food, that's what gets you. It's a giant monument. It's a very large obelisk with bronze reliefs on it, but what was probably more important at the time was that list of political offices. So he's the last of our Civil War presidents. And so his passing is sort of the end of an era. So listing out his political accomplishments is sort of pointing out just how important this generation of statesmen was.
There's always 2 histories. We always talk
Yes.
about 2 histories to a monument, what the monument is giving tribute to and the time at when it was made. So
Yeah, there's another interesting side story. There's another Clevelander involved in this and in the monument. It's Marcus A. Hanna, who we'll be talking about in our next gig, so to speak. Mark Hanna was sort of the Karl Rove of the 19th century. He sort of packaged William McKinley as breakfast cereal and sold him to the United States to get him elected. And Mark Hanna also served in the Civil War, but he had a cushy job. He served in the units that were guarding Washington, D.C., which never really got attacked. But you have this connection between the two of them. And this gets into this whole issue of the people in Ohio who rose to political prominence because of the Civil War.
Yeah, there you go. All right. In fact, let's kind of turn to that topic. Cleveland and the Civil War was the topic tonight. Actually helped Cleveland a lot.
Oh, yes. Oh,
so
yes.
let's talk about that a little bit.
Chrisfield Johnson, a historian of Cleveland, wrote in Cuyahoga County history that the Civil War, I'm sort of paraphrasing, saw Cleveland as a large village. It left it as a major city. And the population of Cleveland really expanded during the Civil War. And why did it expand? Because we had access to the lake. We had access to commodities coming in. We also had nascent iron industry, the Cleveland rolling mills out in Old Newburgh. They were re-rolling railroad rails. Railroads were the sinew of the Union effort, and of course, it was a Confederate effort. And then you also had people who really built railroads. There are 2 people who come to mind. One is a man named John H. Devereaux, who was a railroad builder, and he was actually in Tennessee laying out a railroad when the war broke out and he came back to Cleveland. Well, Devereaux would become second in command of the Union military railroads under Herman Haupt. The other person is, it's not John D. Rockefeller, but we're looking at Devereaux, but we're looking at Jephthah Homer Wade. You know Wade Park? Named after Jephthah Homer Wade, who was born in the Finger Lakes district of New York and helped create something called Western Union Telegraph. And so in 1856, Wade and his family moved to Cleveland. They lived on Huron and eventually had homes on Euclid Avenue. And the telegraph and the railroads really gave the Union a major edge in the war. So we're looking at internet, if you will, and transportation. And so these 2 people did that, which leaves me with the question is that how do you finance a war? And get into this. This is Jay Cook, the man from Sandusky. He was born in Sandusky. He went to Philadelphia, became a banker there. And then during the war, how many of you remember buying U.S. savings bonds? Okay. Well, you can thank Jay Cook for that, because to finance the war, the Union had to raise money. And it raised money by offering bonds. And Cook did one that I think was 420, was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be paid back after 4 years or 20 years. It paid 6%. He did another one called the 370 or something, which paid 3 years and 7%, And he took these bonds, and rather than just sitting in his banking office and saying, buy these bonds, he sent agents out around the country to peddle the bonds. And this is what helped finance the Union. So this is Jay Cook. If you've anybody been to Gibraltar Island in Lake Erie? His summer home is on Gibraltar Island in Lake Erie. Okay. But we're looking at that. We're also looking at the fact that the federal government makes paper money legal tender. And in order to buy these bonds, you didn't need to use hard specie cash. You could buy the bonds with paper money, greenbacks as they were called. But when the bonds came due, you got paid back in gold. And this leads me to an eternal question as to Cleveland in the Gilded Age and how many people bought these bonds, and how many people were being recompensed with gold, and how much of that fortune helped build not only industries but some of the institutions in Cleveland. Philanthropy. I can't prove that. That's a suspicion on my part.
All right, now here's the thing. Before the Civil War, Cleveland was basically a commercial village. After the Civil War, it was basically based on manufacturing. Is that correct?
Yeah, it grows into manufacturing. Iron mills are needed. We also have a nascent garment industry. Uniforms come out of measurements that were done during the Civil War. Meghan can speak to this. And then, you have Rockefeller, who's buying and selling commodities. And if you were here for the Rockefeller talk, you know this, so you can go get a drink. But the point with Rockefeller is that he gets into oil coming out of the ground in Pennsylvania, close to where Meghan is from. Yeah, and they're marketing it as kerosene. And so by 1870s, the biggest industry in Cleveland, Ohio is petroleum. So it changes, and you're looking at a city that goes from 40,000 before the Civil War to nearly, I think, 400,000 at the turn of the century, and to over nearly 900,000 in 1920.
Just amazing stuff. All right, guys, I'm looking at my clock, and I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Now, guys, we are recording this tonight for a podcast. Ripples Across the Land. So Teddy's out there with a microphone. Question at the bar. So go ahead.
All right. One question. You were just talking about money. During the Civil War, merchants were allowed to make up their own pennies because there wasn't belief in the paper money. And in Berea, Ohio, and many other places in the Cleveland area, they made pennies that could be used as legal tender.
Yep.
And those things are very collectible today. The other thing is Camp Cleveland had 20,000 people and 200 buildings in a little area called University Heights.
Yep.
But that was actually in Tremont at that point.
Or as we call it now, Tremont.
All right, another question right there.
The Kozad family is a very famous family in Cleveland, most of whom are buried at the East Cleveland Presbyterian Church on Euclid Avenue, which is a 200-and-something-year-old church. Could you talk a little bit about the Underground Railroad? I've been in that church. I know they stored slaves in that church. We have the Kozad Bates house as a memory of all of that history. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, definitely, because we, at the Historical Society, we help do the content for the Kozad Bates House, and my late colleague Ed Pershey did the bulk of the work, and after Ed passed away, unfortunately, I took over the work. But the Kozads, the Bates, and the Fords, that whole area of East Cleveland was largely populated by people from New England who had that mentality. And one of the hardest things to prove is that were people actually sequestered in that house. And we have memoirs from the Ford family that talk about the family working with former enslaved people, sitting down for dinner together. Formerly enslaved people harvesting lumber where Lakeview Cemetery is. So that is there. The most remarkable document I've ever seen at the Historical Society is an 1840s diary entry from Horatio Ford, which basically reads, "Sent 2 fugitives on their way today in a wagon." And basically says that anybody who has ever harbored a panting fugitive will understand the evils of slavery. To find somebody writing that in a diary as evidence, now this is before the draconian act of Fugitive Slave Act of the 1850s, that takes guts to do that, and that's proof of the pudding. So we can't prove that people were in the Kozad Bates house, but we know those families were intimately connected with it. And the point about the Underground Railroad, which is very important, it is not simply a white enterprise. It's a black and white enterprise. Madison Tilley, contractor, John Brown, the barber, they're all connectors in this. Alfred Greenbrier, who lived on the west side, had horses. So we have these stories, and that's one of the things that the whole Underground Railroad is, in a way, I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time. It's compounded because a lot of it's from memory, but there have been documents found, and we can attest to it's important. The Quakers down in the south of Ohio were the first stop for many of the people who came over. Ohio was one of the greatest ports for slaves who were going to freedom because it's a lake port. And to have absolute freedom, you needed to get out of the United States.
All right, very cool. Teddy, right there.
I have to bear with me. I have two questions. I went to a National Park Service event in Franklin, Tennessee, at a battlefield site that is, they claimed, in 4 hours, 10,000 people got killed or wounded. So it says third bloodiest battles of war. But the point made, I'll never forget, is they said the preponderance of the northern soldiers in that battle were from Cuyahoga County. Yet I've never seen that referenced here or interpreted here. I mentioned it to the Soldiers and Sailors Monument once, and they weren't aware of it. I would love that to be explored here. That's one question. The other relates...
Let her answer
okay,
it.
go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I would, I trust the National Park Service, but I'm not as familiar
She
with
works
that.
for the National Park Service.
I'm going to start working. Not currently employed by them, but will be officially soon. But I do know that the large majority of soldiers from this area and from Ohio in general served in the Western theater of the war, which would be accurate to that portion. It's not till later that they end up getting more of them moved over. The 23rd is in the Eastern theater, but even they spend a little bit of time in the Western theater before they get moved over. So it would make sense that there was a good portion of Cuyahoga boys fighting there because a lot of the Ohioans are there.
The other one relates to your Encyclopedia of Cleveland History. You mentioned you can add on to something if you can prove it. I was director of the warehouse district when we first started researching it. And on the Weddell House, the north wing where Lincoln spoke from that balcony stood till 1961. And the room he stayed in supposedly had a plaque till it was demolished in 61. And one of the points made by that in our notes was there was no historic preservation movement or no outcry that wing of the Weddell House, which attached to the back north of the Rockefeller building, wasn't protected at all. So I didn't know if any of that's in your knowledge about the Weddell House, because it was kind of an anecdotal statement.
There are objects in the collection of the Western Reserve Historical Society, I may have mentioned this before, perhaps a desk that was in the room that Lincoln occupied at that point. There's an engraving of him speaking from the balcony of the Weddell House. But the loss, you're absolutely right, Tom, the loss of the Weddell House was truly, truly sad because that was the major hotel in Cleveland. It was the stop for anybody who was anyone coming in at that time. But it was obliterated like much of the warehouse district was before they stopped that.
The other story on that street is that it's told, it might be true, that John Wilkes Booth performed at the Academy Theater during that same time period that Lincoln was here on Bank Street.
Yeah, we know that the Booth family were frequent visitors to Cleveland, and there's a new book hopefully coming out on vaudeville in Cleveland that really connects to some of this stuff.
Wow.
So do we know if he was here during the speech? Dolly the trolley used to say so.
Yeah, well, you know, unless he left his itinerary on the internet, we don't know.
All right, Teddy, up here. She's been waving her hand.
Is it true that women disguise themselves as men to fight in the battles?
Fantastic question.
And if so, are their names on the Soldiers and Sailors Monument?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'm not sure on the follow-up, not that I know of on that. However, yes, absolutely. There were women who disguised themselves as men and fought as soldiers. We know of 3, actually, specifically 3 women who disguised as men fought at the Battle of Fredericksburg alone. So we know 3 from a single battle. Sarah Emma Edmonds, she worked as a courier and was on horseback writing messages from the headquarters to the front lines and back. There was another young lady who was 14 when she signed up when the war started. She was found out 7 times and re-enlisted every time. the way you usually would get found out would be if you were wounded. And so that's what happened to her after the Battle of Fredericksburg. She got wounded there. They take you to a doctor and surprise, things are a little different, right? And there was one other woman whose name we do not know. The other girl, Lizzie Compton was her name. There's a third woman from New Jersey whose name we don't know, but we know she was there. She was promoted to sergeant. We don't know exactly what regiment. We just know she was from New Jersey. She was promoted to sergeant for valor on the field. And we know about her because there was we have a letter that says that, strange news today, our sergeant gave birth. So somebody knew, but she was. That letter is from end of January, beginning of February of 1863. Which, if you know anything about the Battle of Fredericksburg, that was in December of '62. She was 7 to 8 months pregnant when that battle happened. So yes, absolutely, women did in fact serve. We have no way of knowing how many did. Yeah. So there's just no way, because women had to cut their hair. This was a disguise, right? So we only know about them if they got caught. We do know of women who just decided to spend the rest of their lives as men. There are some who were taken care of in soldiers' homes and lived the rest of their lives as men. And we can only speculate as to why. I imagine the freedom granted to men once you come from 19th century womanhood, probably some pretty good freedoms that you're not going to want to give up, right? So, yeah.
Right. Very cool. Let's go out there. Go ahead.
Okay, on the women's issue, you'll like this. There was a colonel that was a female that I have letters talking about. So yes, there was women that rose to the rank of colonel. The other thing, John, you've talked about John Brown, not the John Brown that's famous, but I think the John Brown that's famous is actually from Hudson, Ohio.
Oh yeah, Hudson, that hotbed, Hudson, Kent.
Right.
He had 20 children, or his wives had 20 children. He's a very, very interesting character. He professed his hatred of slavery openly in a church, and took on that commission, so to speak, during the Kansas-Nebraska period, the fights in Missouri. He and his sons broadsworded to death, I think, five sort of Southern sympathizers. And then he was here talking about that trial of the Oberlin Wellington rescuers. He was here in Cleveland in disguise, supposedly recruiting people for his next gig, which was going to be the attack on the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, which was essentially, that was high treason at that point. And the question about John Brown is, if you read the newspapers at the time, and I'm teaching a course on Civil War right now, and that's what my students are doing, was how soon did he become a hero after that? And by the time that the Union Army was being formed, they were singing John Brown's body is a moldering in the grave. So he turns around. It's a very, very interesting. I did a little promo here. Dennis Keating, emeritus professor, retired professor, has a book from Arcadia Publishing called Cleveland and the Civil War. And so you should look into it. Viewed it with Dennis, so that's one easy way to look at this.
All right, very cool. All right, up there, last question.
You spoke about a relatively abolitionist sentiment in Northeast Ohio around this time. How was that reflected in the rest of the state?
Oh, God. Northern Ohio is a different entity than Southern Ohio. Now, Cleveland, if you look at the election results for Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and 1864, you will find Lincoln solidly winning to the east of Cleveland, the counties of Austinburg and so forth. In Cleveland, it's a fairly solid thing. If you go to the south of the state, forget about it. You have butternuts down there because it's a complex thing. You can't break down the Civil War state by state. It's region by region. So the southern part of Ohio was settled by people from Virginia and the southern colonies.
Yeah, and it borders Kentucky, which at that time was allowed slavery. Yeah. So you have this very close influence of slavery in southern Ohio.
Yeah. Now, can I throw a little zinger in here? Yeah. There's a man named Charles Whittlesey. There's a new book out on Charles Whittlesey, and he was a polymath. He did archaeology in ancient Indian ruins in Ohio. He did geology. He discovered some of the iron and copper fields in the north. and he served in the Civil War. He was the man who built the fortifications around Cincinnati. Charles Whittlesey is also the founder in 1867 of the Western Reserve Historical Society, and his papers are there.
Oh, man, very fascinating. Big round of applause, everybody. Holy cow, what a great night. I want to point one thing out. Meghan has been, kind of strawing a very delightful drink called a Shirley Temple.
Yeah, and Mike, can I say a word here?
Yes.
One of the good things about teaching is to have students like this. And that's what keeps me going.
Well, big round of applause, because he's losing these two students off to their careers. Be safe going home, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight.